Good evening, everybody. Sorry. It was like there was that moment of silence and then everybody started chatting again. I feel like my timing was off. All right. Thank you very much for being here this evening. My name is Duncan White. I convene the Writers Speak series for the Mahindra Centre for the Humanities. And this evening it's my great honour to introduce Raven Leilani, who will be in conversation with Jesse McCarthy. Raven's debut novel, Lustre, was published in 2020 to rapturous reception, described by Zadie Smith as exacting, hilarious, and deadly. Over 36 publications listed Lustre among their best books of the year, and the novel won the National Book Critics Circle John Leonard Prize, the Kirkus Prize, and the Dylan Thomas Prize, among others. Her short fiction has been published in the Yale Review and The Cut, among other places, and her 2019 story, Breathing Exercise, won a Pushcart Prize. Lustre is now being turned into an HBO series, I believe. Yeah. But no less importantly, has found its way onto many Harvard syllabi, including many courses taught by members of the audience, but also by Jesse McCarthy. So it is fitting that Raven will be in conversation with Jesse, a novelist, essayist, and scholar who is assistant professor in English, African and African American studies here at Harvard. Jesse is the author of the critically lauded 2021 novel, The Fugitivities, and the outstanding essay collection, Who Will Pay Reparations on My Soul, which won the 2022 Whiting Award for Non-Fiction. Very excited to hear this conversation. But before we get started, please, could I just remind you all to silence or switch off your cell phones? And just to let you know that there will be a microphone circulating so that people can hear you ask your questions. So just wait for that to get to you before you ask your questions at the end. So no further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Raven Leilani and Jesse McCarthy.
So I think I'm going to read just a bit from the book, and let me know if you have trouble hearing. This requires, I think, only a little bit of prefacing. The speaker is seeing a man in open marriage, and they have dated a bit, and she desperately wants to have sex. That's all you need to know. On the third date, I'm sure we are going to have sex. I shave everywhere, take a straight razor to my arms and legs, hold the blade at 30 degrees as a brownout courses through my neighborhood. And when I arrive at the clinic, he kisses my neck and whispers in my ear, and we both get tested for STDs. The fluorescents wash him out, but on this occasion, his neuroses is full bleed, and he tells me he does not like hospitals because they smell like urine and synthetic gardenias, and also he is terrified of dying. And theoretically, so am I, but theoretically, what if I'm not? Though saying this out loud is ungenerous, and so I tell him, yes, living is definitely what I want to keep doing. It has been great so far. But mostly I'm hoping I don't have chlamydia. And so I miss a great deal of what he tells me about his fear of death. And I notice a pamphlet with a white baby on it. And after our tests come back clean and we go for burgers, I don't eat anything because I still want to have sex, but I'm still thinking about the baby, about the potential softness of its head. And as I'm thinking about this abortion I had at 16, his wife calls him and he leaves because it is July 3rd. Barbecue prep needs to be done. And one of the rules is that if she calls, he has to go. During this exchange he has over the phone, a tendril of her voice peels through the air, wireless and sweet, and he says, "Rebecca, come on, Rebecca." And between dates 4 and 6, I'm feverishly looking her up, but Rebecca Walker is too common a name, and Eric, while committed to the digitization of flake glass plate negatives in his professional life, refuses to submit to the inevitability of the digitization of his own thoughts, meals, and whereabouts out of self-righteous Luddism or general old manness, meaning I can't find her through him. And I lie awake at night and ponder the Twitters of a dozen generic white women, looking for clues and only finding interchangeable results. By date 7, there is still no sex, which is getting insulting, but I will debase myself entirely to get the things that I want, and so on all the way through our 9th date, after we've been seeing each other in person for a month, and I'm doing what I will with popsicles and bananas and yanking him into the bathroom by his lapels, this close to threatening him, and he laughs at me and tells me softly, "Stop." Because he's a little old-fashioned and finds my behavior embarrassing, and because my embarrassment typically inverts into anger, I shove him away and am surprised and pleased when he shoves me back. His contrition is immediate and effusive, but I've already archived the look on his face, the glimmer of teeth, the glee with which he exercises his strength. And when he helps me up from the ground, the heft in his hand is the contact that will sustain me for 5 days, because one of the rules is that his wife can change the rules, and one of the new rules is that we can only see each other on the weekends. And so regrettably, on Sunday, he's climbing the stairs to my apartment because it's the only private place I know where I might coerce him out of his clothes. The salmon smell is gone, but my roommate is on the couch clipping her toenails in a terrifying vitamin C sheet mask, and up until this point, I've sufficiently hidden the extent of my poverty. But now he's going to see the puckered linoleum and the casserole dishes collecting water in our bathroom. He's going to know that he hasn't been taking me out to restaurants so much as providing much-needed calories. And when he comes up the stairs, his face is shiny and incredulous, like what has happened to him is terrible, but he is impressed enough by the novelty to persevere. He closed the door behind him, and my roommate is raising her eyebrows behind her mask, because not even in my own home am I safe from this look, this acknowledgement of our asymmetry, which even in New York is a stumbling block for waitresses and cabbies, and which Eric is totally oblivious to, even as I'm routinely making assurances that yes, we are going to the same place, and yes, it is a single check. Because you have to go through the bathroom to get to the kitchen, and through the kitchen to get to my bedroom, he basically gets a complete tour, and is so kind about the whole thing, he doesn't even mention the rice-a-roni my roommate has left on the back of the toilet. In fact, as I lock the bedroom door behind me, he seems to find the whole thing very adventurous. Though when he thinks I'm not looking, I can tell he is concerned. I can tell he is revising me in his head, trying to square the concept of my adulthood with the 6th floor walk-up and the parameters of my room, which allow for only a futon and a poster of MF Doom. As I am standing there with my back to the door, he settles down on the futon, gingerly, like he's afraid the frame will not support his weight. I know that the dissonance is finally dawning on him in a serious way. And while I never enter a room without wondering what personal adjustments need to be made, it's strange to see it happen to this friendly white Midwestern man. It is strange to see him noticing about himself what I always notice, the optimism, the presumption, this rarefied alternate reality in which there is nowhere he does not belong. He looks around with this gentle horror in his eyes, as if it has just occurred to him, upon the introduction of this economic dimension, the mutual desperation involved in merging two people at opposite ends of life. And then he spots my paint and a blank canvas, and I run over to close the closet door, but it is too late. He wants to know why I've never mentioned it, and if I'm any good. And I don't know if it's because this whole night has been humiliating, but I tell him yes, I'm pretty good. Which is another mistake, because of course he wants me to commit him to paint. So I pull some Stoli from underneath my bed and pour it into the one clean mug I have, and we take turns drinking from it, wilting in the heat, and forgiving the gulf between us long enough to halfway undress. And he is not a great model, slouching and always changing the direction of his head. But as he reclines, half out of his clothes with his long arms and faint freckles and chaos of curly graying hair, I remember my body and become sensitive to his, to the dwindling proportion of air in the room, to the way he looks at me as I establish my palate, like he isn't just humoring me, like he's taking me seriously. And while I appreciate his seriousness, it makes me sick to my stomach. It spoils his beauty into a series of halftones between creases of flesh, the lilac and bice blue, the potency of a little titanium white, and the vodka fattening his tongue when he says he's sorry he pushed me. And I say, how sorry are you? And he says, very sorry. And I say, then beg for my forgiveness, which he does adequately while I give him head. Finally, for the first time, my bedroom deadly silent except for his soft, breathless apologies, which I think he actually means as he carefully moves my hair out of the way. Though later, I clean the acrylic from his thighs and tell him, actually, I'd like it if he pushed me again. He thinks I'm joking, and when he realizes I'm not, his face darkens, and he says he doesn't feel comfortable with that. This is the last time he comes to my apartment. When we go out to eat a few days later, I see that he is aware that he is feeding me, as much as I'm aware that there is a large part of his life I cannot see, a place in Jersey with a driveway and a mailbox and extra towels, sustained on imagination alone, because one of the rules is that I am not allowed inside his house. And things come up. One of us gets sick. I can't muster enough will to open my mail or wash my hair. He has a business trip or a dinner party with Rebecca, and by the time we meet again, we have forgotten how we fit. We are in a state of constant regression, distance rendering the details too slippery to grasp. And then on Thursday night, day 52 of our excruciatingly chaste courtship, he calls me and tells me to meet him at a club in Soho and to wear something short. I do what he says, even though I've given up on the prospect of sex, because it turns out maybe he's the only friend I have. So I eat half a chocolate cake and arrive at the club in cutoffs and sneakers, so ready to fuck that when someone brushes up against me on the train, I make a scary, involuntary noise. Eric emerges from the club through a wall of smoke and pulls me inside with his large, clammy hand, and all around me are the campy trappings of 1975. He leads me to the center of the pit by the tips of his fingers, and the air is thick with mist and sweat and plumes of artificial fog, the strobe and smoke machine's combined effort, churning out these puffy orange convex knives, and I sneeze into my elbow and make eye contact with a dog who is sitting in the corner chewing someone's silk slipper, which bums me out, as it always does when animals look to be in places they don't want to be. A parade of synthetic fabrics moves in unison under the liquid clip of light, like a school of silver herring, and some bunting near the stage that says fever pulls away from the ceiling, and it occurs to me that this is one of those places in the business of reproducing a decade for the night, because in the bulletin by the door indicates that in a few weeks it will be the 90s. But for now, a workable hologram of Chaka Khan overtakes Gloria Gaynor and her bouncy curls, and Chaka is cooing in her fame-shredded panties, squatting and saluting at the end of the stage, flexing her brown thighs and smirking into the crowd, though the music that is actually playing is Casey and the Sunshine Band's That's the Way, which makes it feel a little spectral, which is how nights like these always feel once the strobes lift for a moment and you see the beer and glitter on the floor, the reanimation of what is dead repackaged and called nostalgia, and all that earnest time travel tempered with irony, because I look around, almost everyone is dancing with the sort of shrugging participation that conveys this whole thing as a joke. Like, how lame, like, I dig this, but not too much. But the beauty of disco is the too much, is the horn section. And so Eric and I convene in a bathroom over a spoon, and someone is in the stall next to us with bare feet weeping. And we go out into the middle, and Eric is a very coordinated white man, but given to fall back on the Cabbage Patch and the Diddy Bop, which is fine. And then we're in his car with the AC all the way up on a reasonable clip through the Holland Tunnel. And he is handing me his phone and asking me to decline a call from his wife, which makes me feel terrible. Not out of any fealty to Rebecca, but because this night appears to have generated from some greater marital drama. Though, of course, I relish denying the call, just as I relish the wave of cicada rippling the air as we pull up to his house, which does indeed have a mailbox with a flag and walker on the side in a jaunty yellow font. And up the stairs inside his bedroom, all the pictures are face down, which is a level of premeditation that gives me pause, that ultimately eases me out of my clothes. Because to do all this, he would have to know I would say yes. He would have to believe himself capable of finessing the initial yes into the terminal yes in such perfect order that I would even go to Jersey. And the idea that he understands this, his total control of the situation, is what does me in. There is no foreplay. I'm still in my socks trying to discern from the wallpaper a conclusion about the marriage that results in this man peeling off his disco socks shirt and pulling me into his lap and apologizing about the delay. Because it's been 13 years with the same woman, he says. 13 years, and all the rules have changed. And so I try to help him out of his pants, but his shoes are still on. Shoes with laces that we both consider for a moment before we opt out and get his pants down only as far as they need to go. His face dark and urgent, his body taut and smattered with coarse curly hair. Slowly, he eases me down onto his grand, slightly left-leaning cock, and for a moment I do rethink my atheism. For a moment, I consider the possibility of God as a chaotic, amorphous evil who made autoimmune disease but gave us miraculous genitals to cope. And so I fuck him desperately with the force of his epiphany, and Eric is talkative and filthy, but there is some derangement about his face, this pink contortion that introduces the whites of his eyes in a way that makes me afraid he might say something we cannot recover from just yet. So I cover his mouth and say, "Shut up, shut the fuck up." which is more aggressive than I would normally be at this point, but it gets the job done. And in general, if you need to pick me up, I welcome you to make a white man your bitch, though I feel panicked all of a sudden to not have used a condom. And I'm looking around the room and there is a bathroom attached. And in the bathroom are what look to be extra towels. And that makes me so emotional that he pauses and is one instant a concerned host rising out of his violent sexual mania, slowing the proceedings into the dangerous territory of eye contact and lips and tongues where mistakes get made, and you forget that everything eventually dies. So it is not my fault that during this juncture I call him daddy, and it is definitely not my fault that this gets him off so swiftly that he says he loves me, and we are collapsing back in satiation and horror, not speaking until he gets me a car home and says, take care of yourself, like, please go. And as the car is pulling away, he's standing there on the porch in a floral silk robe that is clearly his wife's, looking like he has not so much had an orgasm as experienced an arduous exorcism, and a cat is sitting at his feet, utterly bemused by the white clapboard and verdant lawn, which makes me hate this cat as the city rises around me in a bouquet of dust, industrial soot, and squash, insisting upon its own enormity like some big dick postmodernist fiction and still beautiful despite its knowledge of itself, even as the last merciless days of July leave large swaths of the city wilted and blank. And then for a week, Eric doesn't answer my texts or my emails or my calls. And I'm maintaining my smile in the middle of my open office plan, leafing through this new book we're putting out on the virtues of sharing. And now I know where he lives, so 10 days after having fucked him in the bed he shares with his wife, I go right up to the door and find it unlocked, and no one is home. So I walk around the house and pick up these cold lemons on the counter and roll them around in my hands, and I open the fridge and take a drink of milk and carry the carton up to the bedroom, where a door opens to a closet with a collection of women's clothes, and I gather the silk and wool and cashmere in my hands, and then there is a voice, and I turn, and standing in the doorway of the attached bathroom in yellow rubber gloves and a t-shirt that says Yale is his wife. Thank you.
Are we on? Okay, great. Thank you for that. I want to begin by getting, right into it. And I think for so many readers, certainly for me, at the center of this novel is a voice, Edie's voice. And for me, when I pick up a novel, I always know pretty much by the end of the first page or two whether or not I'm going to finish the book.
Sure.
I have to believe, I have to know that the prose is going to earn my attention. And in the case of Luster, in the case of your novel, I knew by the end of the first sentence.
Thank you.
It's a magnificent first sentence, and it's one that when I teach the novel, I ask my students to parse. And something about your sentences has caught the attention of critics. Something about the kind of their spikiness, the way you include a kind of surprise and kind of elements of a kind of twist, give it this just incredibly distinctive liveliness, this vividness. And I was wondering sort of how this voice came to you. Toni Morrison talks about, sort of meeting her characters. It's almost this kind of ghostly thing where she says, they're sort of forced upon her. They're sort of uninvited guests.
Yes.
And when they show up, then she sort of has to get to know them. But there are other writers who say, no, I sort of have to begin writing something, and then I sort of wander into a voice or wander into a character and find them. I know that's certainly my case. And there's something very difficult about sustaining the first person. And
Yes.
Henry James famously talks about the terrible fluidity of self-revelation, which I feel was coming in my mind as you were just reading just then. That makes, the first person challenging instrument to play for the length of a novel. And so I was wondering how you found your way to this voice, to Edie's voice. Did it kind of sort of fall upon you all at once, or was it something you kind of waded into and you discovered something as you were going along and it kind of unfolded for you?
I think it's a little bit of both what you described, what Morrison was saying, sort of voice as a possession and also voice as an evolution of finding it out, discovery. I think I can't, can you all hear me? I can't divorce the sort of tenor of the voice from what I was feeling, what I was doing at the time I began this draft, I was in, it was in my graduate program. I had written a book that I'd come in with, I'd finished it, I cared a lot about it. And I think in the first couple weeks, I met with one of my mentors who asked me an important question, and one that it's important to me to be earnest when I'm drafting, but it meant something to hear the question from a person who I respected and revered. And the question was, did I mean it? And so I went home and I looked at my, the book I'd come into the program with. And I think I had meant that, but I felt that I could do better. I could be more vulnerable. And there was 2 years I had allotted to write in that program, even though I was, still working. And time felt really finite. It felt fraught with, I wanted to finish something in that time. And so I began this book. I remember it well. I went home, I put away the feelings I had about having to put the other book in a drawer. And I started this book in a panic. It was really, it's the fastest I think I'll ever write a book. It was both that I have to have something, I have to have a draft, but also in that panic, there was no room to self-edit. There was no room for like self-consciousness. Id was leading me. And I think that became Edie's voice, but also her preoccupations. She is a person who is grappling with artistic failure. She's a person who is full of need and want, and that was important to write a wanton Black girl who's kind of flailing and who is prone to limerence and fixation. And I think those qualities imbue a voice with a kind of spikiness, the way you put it. And more structurally, the sentence level has always been really important to me. I started in poetry. Those were the first things I ever published. My first experiences with publishing were poems. And so the focus on the sentence level and the sort of minute detail on the rhythm and the sound, and on the surprise, which, like with humor and comedy, is essential to poetry, was still with me when I had made the transition into prose. Language is so important to me. So the voice came from where I was at the moment, what the requirements of a wanton character, created, and my obsession with the texture of a line.
Yeah. It's fascinating because I definitely noticed this about your sentences right away, and it's something we have in common. I also came to fiction first through poetry. And I think there's always a trace of that. You can tell, I think, often in certain kinds of writers,
yes,
when that's sort of the trajectory that they followed, and you can really feel it at the level of this sentence in this novel. Obviously, one of the, even in the passage you just read, one of the deep preoccupations and themes of Luster is sex and desire. You come at it in a really interesting way, though. I mean, for those who haven't read him, but we already got some sense of this, right? Edie's getting involved romantically with Eric, who's older, who's white, he's a Midwesterner, and there's this kind of awkward open marriage with Rebecca, also a white woman, also Jewish.
Yes.
Yeah. And they live in the suburbs in New Jersey. They also have an adopted Black daughter, Akila, and she sort of wanders into this world, but it's a setup that allows you to explore kind of the obvious power imbalances in these relationships, but also in some ways to avoid some of the what I might call sort of the moral cliches of the marriage plot, kind of like infidelity in a kind of more obvious way. And so it seems to me at least, that it allows you to explore desire in a really deep level. You published an essay just last week in the New York Review of Books.
Yes.
An essay called "Meaning It."
Yes.
So I heard the echo of what you were just saying, and it's a fabulous essay that, on one level, is about the tricky business, certainly I feel, of figuring out how to write a good sex scene.
Yes.
Or maybe just how to write well about sex. But it's also more fundamentally about writing and desire.
Yes.
And the relationship between the two. And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about what prompted you to write that essay, and maybe a little bit about how desire was something you wanted to explore in the novel. Sure.
And, earlier when you mentioned Toni Morrison's sort of philosophy on character, I thought about that because that is the idea of being open to the character that comes to you, to the inspiration that comes to you. I think is part of the argument that I was trying to build in that piece, which that it's a kind of id spiritual kind of you're open enough to receive the signal, rather than the kind of more concrete and limiting ideas of what that labor can look like. Though I do think the practical demands of sitting down to write and making it a practice are important. What moved me to write that essay, I'm preoccupied with how to render sex on the page in a way that feels vulnerable, in a way that feels honest, and in a way that inhabits a kind of gray area, and that is pointedly amoral. I didn't want, as I wrote, I was, especially around the sort of fidelity plot that you brought up, as I wrote, I was very conscious of the familiar way to tell the story. The idea of Edie and Rebecca strictly as sexual competitors, rather than what I wanted for them, which is to have their own relationship that has its own strangeness, its own intimacies, and which the sort of man between them is more the material. And so I steered away from the sort of familiar ideas around what that looks like, an open marriage and cheating and infidelity. But I also wanted to write about abjection and agency. And it was necessarily a complicated thing to render when the speaker, the person at the center of the narrative, is a Black woman. And so her body exists already in this sort of vulnerable, imperiled state. And so to invite a kind of dominance, to crave domination and obliteration, is kind of a complicated thing to render. And as I was writing forward, I felt the risk of maybe doing that wrong, and I felt the anxiety and even perhaps resentment that I could not just be free in writing forward the agency in submission. And so I was drawn to Garth Greenwell's Cleanness, because it's a great text on submission and dominance, but also the trickiness of consent and not knowing. And when I was writing that piece, there is a kind of eroticism, and not strictly like sexual, but an erotic energy, a procreative energy of not knowing. The idea of that as a place where we draw generative energy. And so when I think about sex, I think about uncertainty. I think about imperfect politics. And I was drawn to write that piece because I wanted to push against a sort of tidy idea around sex, just from what I felt when I was writing the novel and what really moves me when I see it on the page. When you see that private experience rendered with specificity, it really, really sings. And yeah, sometimes that specificity is not like, sometimes it's strange and it's complicated. And I was hoping to make room for that. I think there's a second part of your question that I forgot.
No, but that's, we can just start, we can continue with that, because I'm remembering, I think there's a moment in the piece where you're quoting Melissa Phoebos, and she's talking about the difference in between the way in which in common parlance or in discourse, and this includes, a lot of stuff around race, we're often reduced to type.
Right.
But that everyone is aware that while, types have a kind of force, especially in the world and in social interactions, there's also private experience, which is kind of irreducible.
Yes.
And we should mention also probably that Garth Greenwell has a wonderful essay called On a Sentence by Raven Leilani that was in the Sewanee Review, I think, which is kind of this magnificent, virtuosic, close reading of the sentence that you, or one of the last sentences from the passage that you read. And it's an extraordinary essay in its own right. But one of the things that I love that he says there is that, it's partly through what you're doing with syntax that kind of allows for a certain kind of embodiment and a suspension of some of that kind of super ego stuff.
Yes.
And allows that messiness and the feeling that I think feels true. I think he says something like, we get into the pulse of her sentence and into the pulse of Edie's body, into the pulse of her character. It's
No, I believe in language as a tool to sort of generate or like reflect the messiness of that experience. I like that you use the word messy, because I think that is what I'm aiming for, and also the idea of fending off the superego in the process. I think that, the superego, I think, or like the more kind of practical control brain is involved in the craft, and that, you plan forward, you sit down, you do your work. I think we all need some of that, but for me, that comes so much later. So much of the work of writing, and I was writing both about sex, but also about writing, and that involves the structure of a sentence, is clearing that. Maybe to speak for myself, the sanctuary that I think you need in order to write, the privacy you need to feel in order to write, and I think that sometimes the superego is a kind of infringement on the process that limits it. And I feel that especially when I'm trying to write sex scenes, you can't be wrapped up in the sort of outside of it all. I think trying to describe it is sort of like the irony. But yeah, I think the sentences themselves are both, I'm excited by the music of a sentence and by the potential of those rhythms and those echoes. And so in some ways it is like beauty that I'm excited about, and aesthetic. And that too feels like it.
Yeah. We should say also that this was also obvious from your reading, but the book is very, very funny.
Thank you.
And but I was thinking about it also in terms. One of the books that I teach in my Black Literary Avant-Gardes class is a sometimes forgotten book by Fran Ross called Oreo, which also has a young Black woman. She's Black and Jewish, and it's just devastatingly funny. But the humor serves in a sense often as a kind of weapon for her. And I'm wondering for you how you think about Edie's humor and sort of how it serves her, or how it served you in your writing.
Definitely. I mean, it's funny, when I first started this book, that quality just kind of happened. And I think it happened in part because I was writing, first person, I think kind of helps it, in that it's a consciousness book. I'm in her mind. And so I'm behind her eyes, and I get to represent the experience of a hyper studious person. And I think that that level of study naturally lends itself to comedy, to observe something deeply and accurately is like the most brutal and funniest thing you can do. And I think the sort of friction between what is happening in the world, in her world, the action versus her thoughts, is also where the comedy comes from. The asymmetry, I think, is often funny. But in terms of the weapon that it is, it's in my book, which I'm like earnest girl. I like write about, I just want everything to be felt and meant and vulnerable, but you can't really talk about comedy without talking about irony. And I think that that is where it becomes a kind of weapon for Edie, in that the comedy is a kind of armor. It's a private discrepancy that she alone experiences, a way of distancing herself from these moments of brutality. And also I think there's a certain clip of brutality that when it mounts, becomes absurd, which is also a kind of comedy. And so I think there's a lot that just simply because of what I was writing, the comedy just cropped up in between.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And it's interesting because that's actually where I was going to go next, is because I feel like, I think a lot of critics picked up on the sort of the comedy at the level of the sentence and, some of the punchlines and again, that kind of spiky quality in Edie's voice. But I feel like you're doing a lot of really interesting and very sophisticated things at the level of structural ironies that crop up throughout the book. In general, I find the novel to be interested in attention, different forms of attention, but therefore also forms of disregard.
Yes.
And, it's one of the ways I feel like you kind of key this up for us in various ways, kind of comes up in how you use kind of setting and background. And so early on, there's this magnificent kind of set piece. It's actually sort of what opens the book, where Eric and Edie are basically going through a kind of what in other circumstances we call sort of basic courtship ritual.
Yes.
But he takes her to Six Flags.
Yes.
To a theme park. And so you have this kind of, the two of them kind of fumbling towards this erotic encounter, but it's happening against this, juvenile and kind of highly confected, artificial background. And it reminded me, whether intentionally or not, sort of to be, it doesn't even matter, but it's this, there's this famous scene in Madame Bovary where Emma Bovary is being seduced by Rodolphe, who's the cad, but he's having to do it at like the county fair, right? And so like he's giving her all these syrupy lines, but Flaubert like intercuts it with like them shouting out the prizes for the biggest pig. Yeah. And, there's all this, manure in the air, and there's just this sense of, the setting really underpinning kind of the bullshit, as it were, what he's saying and what he's doing. But I sense you doing a kind of similar version of that, and it's not only in that scene. I mean, there's also this kind of amazing kind of almost rapturous, carnivalesque, but also very dark scene at the end in the Comic-Con scene. I don't know if was there something also there for you? And in other words, it seemed to me like it wasn't only at the level of personal defense, but that there's also a kind of pointed kind of social commentary in a certain kind of way about America in a certain time and place, and the conditions that it affords and the ways that it conditions our intimacy and our, how we're able to connect with each other against these backgrounds.
Sure, and I mean, those are the scenes that feel absurd, and where I wrote toward their absurdity. Though I have to, be honest and confess that I simply wanted to write a scene at Six Flags, and also Comic-Con. Like those were the things I knew that I wanted to do. And on that sort of side note, I really, really love writing scenes where there's a lot of like sort of body, a lot of motion. So there's like a mosh scene in there.
Yeah.
Like gathering scenes are so exciting to me because it's motion. And I like that sort of quality about sentences too. And so it kind of gives me a sense of like propulsion that I can kind of like hook my sentences onto. But I do think that as I was writing that first scene, I do remember in workshops, I did workshop this first chapter. Everyone was like, why Six Flags? But I think it's a perfect context to like provide the friction of this courtship that is happening. There is like I love discomfort too. That should be noted, which is another kind of genre of comedy. I love the feeling of cringe. And I'm often there's a party scene in the book where I was like doing my best to make it feel uncomfortable. And I feel like there is like there's an extreme discomfort in like the forced merriment that is generated by an environment like that, where there are the Dippin' Dots and like the Looney Tunes characters, and they're trying to relate to each other while all this noise is happening, and they're having a bad time and can't have this kind of earnest interaction where that's acknowledged. And so I get to write about the performance that's happening, but also with Edie, like nod Eric's head, the sort of private part that's happening as they're trying to kind of make it through this day that's supposed to be fun. So that friction was really important to me. And Comic-Con too. That felt like thank you for noticing that sort of echo. I hadn't really thought about those as two kind of like answering each other in that way. But Comic-Con too, it gave me a chance to play with all the characters in one place, if I'm being more literal about it. And it gave me the context in which like conversations could actually be had. There is like a real, genuine conversation that happened in that environment, which is like the opposite of how it begins. But these are environments in which there is some element of performance of we're having a great time, even though this is terrible. And in Comic-Con, we're in costume and also trying to make it through this day. But yeah, I like playing with that kind of, I like to always have a little asymmetry as I'm writing.
I have one more question I wanted to get to. It's a bit of a complicated, long one, but I want to get to it. But you can all begin to think about questions you would like to ask. We'll open it up after this. I wanted to talk about art and the artist and the young woman as artist. This is a novel about a young woman who is trying to assert herself as an artist, trying to become something. To realize her own self-portrait is something that gets threaded through, to capture something in art about her life and about the quality of that life, and to document it. As she said, there's kind of an interest in documentation. One of my absolute favorite moments in this book is, it's actually kind of a moment of gesture, almost a plea. And it occurs late in the novel at a moment when Edie is undergoing a medical operation. I'm not going to say what it is because I don't want to spoil. But she's in the hospital and she's being attended to, and the nurse asks her about her employment. And Edie says, I don't do anything. And they're bringing her in, they're going to put her under. And just as they're going about to do that, she changes her mind.
Yes.
And she says, I'm quoting you here, she says, it feels important that I be earnest. And I grab her arm and tell her that actually I am an artist. And the way you give us that moment, it just feels so real to me and so utterly convincing. It's exactly what Edie would do, but I think it's also very kind of poignant and to a certain extent pathetic truth that anyone who's ever tried to create or be an artist, I think, can really relate to. And even as all of this is happening, because Edie is Edie, she sort of notices that there's a Wyeth painting that's kind of horrible for this location. And there's this note of comedy. And throughout the novel, there are these nods to her love of art. I feel like Rembrandt's anatomy lesson, can talk more, I don't have time, but I feel like anatomy plays such an interesting role in general in this novel. The ending also, I feel like, has a certain echo to another famous woman artist in literature, Lily Briscoe, with her forceful, "I've had my vision" at the end of To the Lighthouse, Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about what painting means to you and your interest in it. And I know this is a super long question, but also, and adjacently, I'd love to hear you say about what do you think the novel as a form can do that other forms like painting, or the many other forms that you also come into this novel, like video games, television, movies, all of these forms that are around us that compete for our attention today. What do you find in fiction? What do you think fiction can do that those other forms can't do?
Sure. So my relationship to painting it's a very personal one. It was the first art I ever did. I was studying for a long time, and I had a portfolio and was going to kind of do that, just like concentrate on that study. And then I decided not to, in part because at that point, I don't think that I had enough hindsight to understand why I stepped away from it. I think now I have a sense of it, which is that I wasn't very good, but also I didn't have the will to be better. I had a lot of ego and a lot of fear, but it was still something I loved a lot. And the book was a way of entering that again, of writing about it, and this medium that I really loved. And in 2020, I was going through a kind of complicated time. My brother and dad passed, and a friend sent me a box of canvases and paints, and I started painting again, and have like refound that connection I had. But in 2019, when I was writing this book, I was quite separate from it, but it was something that I loved deeply. And my brother is the person who gave that to me. And the scene that you picked out is also quite personal. I had a kind of a respiratory ailment in around 2016 that took a long time to kind of figure out what was happening. And I was being wheeled into the surgery theater, and they just make small talk with you, like, what do you do? And it was one of the first times when I said, I'm a writer, and I hadn't gone back to try and write the book and make a real crack at it. But that was essentially the experience I had. That moment felt like it required a kind of earnestness. And so that's where that comes from. But my relationship to painting is that it's one of my favorite things. And like writing, it is something that I find I can disappear into. Like, there's no daylight at all. And my favorite things are those escape hatches. And I guess that's kind of leads me into that's into the novel. Yeah. And I think that for me, the novel is, even though, you can, this is first person, so it's a particular case, but I feel like it's the best way to exist in someone's consciousness. You get that, you get the unmediated thought. Nothing is private. And I also wrote about that in the essay you brought up, but that is my favorite thing about the novel is its its capability for voyeurism, to be let into deeply into someone's experience in a way that, other mediums can do, but maybe not as profoundly. And then I love movies and I love video games, which I think even as you brought that up as an example, and that also works differently for me. Like they're playing role-playing games in the book, in which you have like a party and you go through the land and find treasures and fight monsters. You're able to sort of project yourself, your experience onto those avatars, and so each medium I think offers entry but the novel is my favorite form of that.
Yeah. Well, I have to say that my own view is that, the novel as feels achieved in the way that Edie says her, she's come to document something. And one of the things that I think is so extraordinary is this capacity of the novel, and this novel in particular, to make you believe and make you feel things as true, even if they're not your experience. Yes. Experiences that I have not had feel like I have had them, like they were, and I believe them. And there is something about accessing that and making that something available in common that I think is just an extraordinary achievement, and one of the many remarkable things about this book.
Thank you.
Let's open it up. We have time for questions. We have some mics circulating around here, and be happy to take your questions.
Hi, my name is Soleil. I'm an undergrad. You were just talking about form and medium, and I was wondering kind of about the HBO adaptation. And what do you think television can do for this book and for this story? But then also, what are you most excited to see adapted? And also, what are you afraid of being lost in translation?
Oh boy. So I'm not super involved with the adaptation. I kind of just they come to me and have questions, and then they go off and I don't hear from them for like weeks or months. So I'm very separate from it. But what I want for it is to be its own animal. I don't expect it to be like the book. There are certain things that I don't want lost, and that is, I don't want it to be tidy. I want it to be as messy as I meant the book, which is harder because I do think that is a medium in which you are more given to a requirement that what you think, what the politics of the thing are very, very legible. And that can mean a kind of over-explained, for lack of a better word, text. So I want it to be, I want it to be its own thing. I think TV, simply because it's visual medium, and I love TV. I think it can do a lot that the book couldn't do, in terms, especially because it's a book about painting and bodies, and being able to see that. I'm really excited about what those scenes would look like on TV. But yeah, those are my thoughts on that.
Have they discussed casting at all with you yet?
They haven't. We have a few people who've written, but we're not even close to that yet.
Hi, my name is James. I got to ask you a question earlier in English 10. So I found that there were some really somewhat strange moments with Rebecca and Edie. The reaction of finding Edie in her house and then inviting her to the anniversary party later, or then meeting her at the delivery of the bone saw and then bringing her in to see the cadaver. I was just curious about how this sort of strangeness functions as an aspect of Rebecca and then affecting their relationship throughout the text.
Sure. I wanted again, that was a response to the more familiar idea of the story in which Rebecca as a character would potentially not want to meet this girl, not want to develop her own intimacies with this girl, and perhaps not want to know anything at all, or be fixated in a way that also feels familiar. And so the tack I took was to subvert that expectation and have Rebecca be a person who would draw her nearer, and get to know her. And also I think the morgue scene, simply, I wanted to write the morgue scene, and so I wrote it. And sometimes it's just like the reason, but also it is that too. They're always, I hoped as I rendered the scenes between them, is a kind of like violence happening in scene when they're together, whether it's mosh, whether it's a body being disassembled, whether it's like the kind of ambient noise of Rebecca in the house, like doing something really physical. Bringing them together was an opportunity to use their bodies, use the space to write against the expectation of what that might normally look like.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Anvita. You mentioned that when you started the book, you started in a panic.
Yes.
Which sounds great. It sounds like kind of fun. I was wondering if during the course of the book you ran into embarrassment while writing it, because I feel like I'm almost embarrassed to read it at parts, like because it's so vulnerable and just like the emotion of limerence is so intense to feel. So yeah, did you feel embarrassed, and how did your relationship to that feeling work?
Thank you. I didn't feel embarrassed writing it. And that doesn't mean that I don't get embarrassed. I'm embarrassed all the time. But I think that when I'm drafting, I feel a certain freeness and unself-consciousness that I may feel later, but in the making of it, I don't feel those things. I don't really feel those things, but I do. There are parts of this book that were vulnerable to write, that felt specific to write, and we've just talked about certain experiences that were extremely personal that were kind of integrated into the book. But if I can make it about me, I think this book too was me wanting to be known. And I think that if you want to be known and you want people to actually come to your book and read, you have to kind of risk being seen. And so because that was my project, because I kind of wanted to unhide myself as I drafted, because that was how this started. The book that came before this didn't feel right because it was like maybe, in a sense, not embarrassing enough. It felt protected. And this was an attempt to do something that felt less self-protective. And so because that was my project, embarrassment wasn't a problem.
Hi, is this a good distance? Right, yeah. Hi, I'm Harry. I was wondering about if you felt any other types of vulnerabilities writing this book, because I know in English 10 you said it was sort of a kitchen sink book, yeah. Where, as you mentioned, it sounds like every career in the book, so many of the experiences are pulled from your personal life. And it made me think about an anxiety that I have with the prospect of writing, which is there's that quote that like everyone has one good book in them. And the fear for me is always, well, once you've written one, then that means there's no good books left. And I was sort of wondering, like, so that's one thing I was wondering, like, when you throw so much of your life into a book, is there a fear that you have a lot of life to live to build up enough of a reservoir to pull from again? Or do you go back to that well? And And also, I think this sort of goes along with it, but in class we were talking about how this book is sort of in keeping with a recent line of books that explore these types of relationships that Edie has with Eric. And if there's like an enhanced vulnerability, knowing that you're putting so much of yourself on the page, but you're also writing something that's sort of like a trendy topic, and it's clear that the book is trying to like satire that and work with it, but I feel like that would make me feel even more uncomfortable with exploring that.
So it definitely is a kitchen sink book, and that like in that as I wrote this, and I don't know if I know this as a fact, but I do wonder how, if it's just a common experience of debut writers where you put everything in it because it feels like your only shot. It feels like your only chance. And so that was a thing that was happening. But I also am a muchness girl. I kind of like think I would have done that no matter what. And the idea of you put everything in it, you have nothing left for the next one. I think that's a real fear. People don't want to repeat themselves, but I actually think it's completely fine to repeat yourself and to return to the things that you're hung up on, that you're preoccupied with. And I think with this book, it kind of runs the gamut in terms of my preoccupations, but there are still opportunities to kind of zero in on perhaps just one or two rather than all. So I think if you have, you put the first book out there, it's everything you care about. You can, in that second, third, fourth, fifth book, it could just be like 2 of the things, 3 of the things. And so I don't really have that anxiety as much, but I do understand that. And I think because you keep on living and you keep accruing experiences, like you always have, and you always sort of replenish that well.
Hi, I'm Nia. I study English at the college. I was wondering when you knew you wanted to write, and then like in those early days, what it was like to be kind of growing in your skill and your confidence as a writer, because I think that's something that's kind of difficult for me.
I think I knew I wanted to write. In undergrad, I started really feeling like it was something that fed me, and that was more when I was only writing poetry, and I was doing slam poetry. It was the first time I was ever on stage, which was terrifying, but important. And so that was a moment in time where I felt that first kind of moment of I'm transported somewhere. This just feels good. Like it just felt good. And so I wasn't necessarily even thinking I want to publish a book. It was that this feels, I have my private kind of safe place in which I can kind of just be and play. And it feels really good. I had been writing for a while before that, but like fan fiction, which was also joy, a fandom of that. I remain a fangirl, and that's part of why the Comic-Con has a presence in the book. But I think I'd worked for, after I graduated undergrad, I worked for 5 years as an archivist, and I wrote at night after I got out of work. And I did that just for some years, and wrote a few books, wrote a bunch of short stories and poetry. And I just didn't want to stop, even though it was, my days were partitioned. I'd work, and then at night I was writing, and that I still wanted to make space for that. It just, I just felt I was serious about it. And then after those 5 years, I started thinking about publishing, and joined a program and began this book.
One over here.
Oh my gosh, so weird to hear myself. You've mentioned a few times that you switched from poetry to prose, and I guess I was just curious about, why you did that. And what you think prose offers you that poetry didn't? Or if you'd ever return to poetry?
I feel like my answer to that is quite short. It's more just I had, and it takes a while for me to land on one because not everything can be a book or even a short story. But when it's a book, it's something that feels suitable to the medium, expansive in a way that a novel can accommodate. Even though I have spent years just working on like one long poem, it really depends on. Yeah, it depends on what the project feels like. Because I still write both, and I can't tell you what makes one light turn on. But the move toward the book, for this book in particular, was that I had a story. I understood that it kind of suited the novel rather than the form I'd been working in.
I just had a question. Do you feel like you changed at all as a person as you were writing this book? I feel like you were maybe alluding to like the before you and the after you a bit, but I don't know if we heard like a declaration like I changed. I was just wondering because it seems like Edie has her own journey, but like hearing you talk in class today, it definitely sounds like it was also a process to write.
Yes, I feel like I really changed pre and post a book. I would say practically, it's been really affirming to have something I made out in the world and that people interact with rigorously and understand in some cases, I feel like more keenly than I do, and like notice things that I haven't noticed about it. It feels that is a really, you're writing before that sort of entry into the world, and I mean, don't just mean the book, I mean before I ever publish anything, it is exclusively this private thing. And I really relished that. It wasn't I didn't feel a sadness about that. But I would say that post-book, there is another aspect of having your work out in the world where you have to do a different kind of work to maintain that original privacy of making things. And I feel like that requires maintenance that it didn't before. So in that way, I've changed. I am now almost 4 years away from the book, and I still really love it a lot. And I hope that still stays the same. There are definitely lines in the book where I look at them and I wish they were different, and this copy is marked up so that I kind of skip over those lines. But I feel that also feels good to feel some distance between me and what I made 4 years ago, to feel like I've grown and have different more intense or less intense fixations on things. I feel really, really different than I did for the book. But also I had a lot of life, personal, familial changes that happened at the same time of publishing this book. And so I think that too really, really changed me.
One last question, if there is one. All right, if not, I'd like to thank Duncan White. I'd like to thank Mary McKinnon and Bruno Carvalho and the Mahindra Center for organizing this. Thank you all for coming. And can we give Raven Leilani a big round of applause?
Thank you so much. This is beautiful.
Thank you, everyone.